Imagine drifting off to sleep, not in your cozy bed with soft blankets, but on a rough sack stuffed with straw that smells faintly of damp earth and smoke. The air around you is cold, and a small fire flickers somewhere in the corner of the room. You hear the sounds of others breathing, your family, maybe a few guests, and perhaps even a chicken or two roosting nearby. Welcome to the world of medieval sleep. It was a time when people didn't simply go to bed and wake up once, but often rose in the middle of the night to pray, talk, or even visit neighbors. A world where the line between dreams and reality was often blurred, and where darkness itself was filled with mystery, danger, and ritual. Tonight, we'll travel back to the Middle Ages and explore the truly strange sleep habits of medieval people. The rituals, the routines, the beds, and the beliefs that shaped their nights. Some of these customs might surprise you. Others might make you thankful for your warm mattress and electricity. Either way, it is a fascinating glimpse into a time when sleep was as much a social and spiritual experience as it was a necessity. Before we begin, make sure you're comfortable. Dim the lights, close your eyes if you like, and take a slow, deep breath. If you enjoy unwinding with stories about the past, be sure to subscribe to History for Sleep. It helps the channel grow and lets me keep making calm, thoughtful journeys into history for you to fall asleep to. Leave a comment letting me know what time you usually listen and what topics you'd like to dream about next. Now, let's slip quietly into the candlelit world of medieval nights, where sleep was divided, beds were crowded, and dreams held the whispers of both heaven and superstition. When we think of night today, we imagine a predictable stretch of darkness between sunset and sunrise, a time when most people rest and the world slows down. But in the Middle Ages, night wasn't just the opposite of day, it was its own mysterious realm. The medieval night was alive with sounds, fears, and beliefs that shaped how people lived, prayed, and most of all, slept. To understand the strange sleeping habits of medieval people, we have to start by understanding what night itself meant to them. For most medieval Europeans, especially peasants living in small villages, the coming of night marked a sharp transition. As daylight faded, people finished their chores quickly. Fires were stoked, animals were brought inside, doors were barred, and prayers were whispered. The darkness was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. There were no streetlights, no glowing lamps, only the faint light of the moon, stars, or a candle. For many, this darkness represented both the presence of evil and the absence of safety. The night was when thieves crept, wolves prowled, and spirits were believed to wander. It was a time to be cautious, to stay close to family, and to find warmth both physical and spiritual. Artificial light was precious. A single candle might represent a small luxury, reserved for those with enough wealth to afford wax or oil. Most peasants relied on the glow of the hearth, which doubled as the center of family life and the source of heat. Once the fire dimmed, the world seemed to vanish into shadow. The rhythms of night followed the flickering of that light. People talked quietly, told stories, or prayed before settling down to sleep. The silence that followed wasn't always peaceful. It could be broken by the howling of animals, the creak of a roof beam, or the faint echo of a bell from a distant monastery. Religious life gave the night another kind of meaning. The church marked time with bells that could ring even after dark, calling monks to prayer at odd hours. Ordinary people might not wake for these vigils, but they were aware of them. Night was sacred, a time when the veil between heaven and earth felt thinner. Many believed that prayers said before sleep had special power, and that dreams could be messages from God or temptations from the devil. Sleep itself was seen as a kind of rehearsal for death, a temporary surrender of the body and soul. The length of the night also changed dramatically through the seasons. In winter, darkness stretched for up to 16 hours, far too long to sleep straight through. This is one reason historians believe that people practiced what is called segmented sleep or biphasic sleep. They would fall asleep for a few hours after dusk, wake up around midnight to pray or talk, and then drift back to sleep until dawn. This rhythm made sense in a world governed by candlelight and cold. It wasn't strange to wake up in the middle of the night. It was expected. The waking period in between was a quiet, reflective time, sometimes called the watch, and it gave people space to think, pray, or even visit neighbors who were also awake. To a medieval person, night was not uniform. It had its own divisions, its own moods. There was the early night, when people settled in and the fire glowed bright. Then came the deep middle, when silence settled and only the bravest or most faithful stirred. Finally came the pale light before dawn, when roosters crowed and the world began to reappear. These stages were as familiar to medieval sleepers as our modern schedules are to us. The night was part of the rhythm of life, as natural and essential as breathing. The fear of the dark, though, was real and justified. With no modern locks or police, homes were vulnerable. A gust of wind could open a wooden shutter. A thief or wandering beggar might appear uninvited. Superstition filled the gaps that logic couldn't explain. People believed in spirits called night walkers, in witches who roamed in shadow, and in souls of the dead that could not find rest. The flicker of firelight could cast strange shapes on the wall, making sleep uneasy. Parents would tell their children to whisper a prayer before closing their eyes, asking for protection through the long hours of darkness. For the wealthy, night held a different texture. In castles and manor houses, night could be a time for late feasts, quiet reading, or secret meetings. Yet even there, darkness reigned. Torches smoked, candles sputtered, and shadows danced along the stone walls. Servants might sleep in the hallways or near the hearth, while lords and ladies retired to canopied beds that offered a small sense of privacy. The night still carried uncertainty, even for those surrounded by guards and thick walls. In the countryside, the night was tied closely to nature. The sound of wind through trees, the lowing of cattle, the rustle of straw, all these were part of the landscape of sleep. Without clocks, people measured time by instinct and by the stars. They lived in tune with the natural world, but that harmony came with vulnerability. The night wasn't something to conquer. It was something to survive. To lie down in a medieval bed was to surrender to a world half known and half imagined. The boundary between waking and sleeping, light and dark, safety and danger was fragile. Every night carried a whisper of uncertainty, but also of wonder. For those who lived then, the night wasn't just an absence of light. It was a living presence, full of mystery, faith, and the rhythm of human breath beneath a vast, starlit sky. If you woke up around midnight every night and stayed awake for an hour or two, you might think something was wrong with you. But in the Middle Ages, that was perfectly normal. People didn't sleep in one long stretch like we do today. Instead, they followed what historians call the two-sleep system, also known as biphasic sleep. They had a first sleep and a second sleep, divided by a quiet, thoughtful period of wakefulness that lasted anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. This rhythm of sleep wasn't a strange exception. It was how most people slept for centuries. The pattern appears in literature, diaries, and even medical texts from the medieval and early modern world. When people wrote about their first sleep, they meant it literally. They would go to bed not long after dusk, sleep for a few hours, and then naturally wake up sometime after midnight. This waking period was called the watch, a calm and often productive time before they drifted off again into their second sleep, which lasted until dawn. Imagine it. You lie down on your straw mattress, wrapped in coarse wool blankets. The fire burns low, casting long shadows on the wall. You fall asleep quickly, exhausted from a day of labor in the fields or work at the forge. Hours later, you open your eyes. It's not morning yet, the room is still dark, but your mind feels clear. You might sit up, stir the fire, or whisper to your spouse. Maybe you say a prayer, check on the animals, or tend to a crying child. In towns and villages, the sound of soft voices and footsteps was not unusual at this hour. People moved quietly, doing small tasks or even visiting a nearby neighbor to share a story or some bread. The world was still, but not silent. Why did they sleep this way? The answer lies partly in nature. Without artificial light, people's bodies followed the rhythm of the sun and the seasons. During the long winter nights, there was simply too much darkness to sleep straight through. Waking in the middle of the night gave people time to reflect, to talk, or to pray. It also suited the spiritual mindset of the age. The church encouraged night prayers, and many believed that the hours after midnight were especially holy, a time when heaven felt close and God's presence could be most keenly felt. Medical theory of the time also supported this rhythm. Medieval physicians, influenced by ancient writers like Galen and Aristotle, believed that sleep helped balance the body's humors. They thought it was natural to wake up halfway through the night, since digestion and bodily processes would reach a certain stage, prompting light wakefulness before the body settled again. In other words, the two-sleep cycle was seen as both healthy and normal. The period between the two sleeps was surprisingly active. Some people prayed or meditated. Others wrote in journals or reflected on their dreams, which were often thought to carry messages or omens. Married couples sometimes used this time for intimacy, as it was considered a quiet, natural moment for closeness. Historical records even suggest that midwives and doctors preferred nighttime for certain treatments or births, since people were calm and privacy was easier to find. But this middle period wasn't always peaceful. In some places, especially in larger towns, the dark hours could be unsettling. The night watchmen patrolled the streets, calling out the time or warning of danger. The sound of a distant bell or the barking of dogs could echo through narrow lanes. For those who lived near forests, the calls of owls, wolves, or other nocturnal animals added to the eerie atmosphere. Yet for many, this mix of fear and stillness was simply the rhythm of life. The night was not just for sleeping, it was for thinking, feeling, and connecting. The idea of two sleeps began to fade only with the arrival of artificial light. As candles became cheaper, and later, oil lamps and gas lighting spread, people stayed awake later into the evening. The night was no longer as long or as dark. By the time the Industrial Revolution arrived, the natural rhythm of first and second sleep had almost disappeared. People started sleeping in one long block to match factory schedules and the clock-driven world of modern life. Still, our bodies remember. Studies have shown that if modern people are kept without artificial light for several days, they naturally begin to fall into a two-sleep pattern, sleeping for a few hours, waking for a while, then sleeping again. It's as though a memory from the past lingers quietly within us, a whisper of medieval nights long gone. For people of the Middle Ages, this rhythm was never questioned. The first sleep and second sleep were simply how life worked. It was a cycle that matched the world around them, the slow burn of firelight, the stretch of darkness, and the gentle arrival of dawn. The two-sleep system gave their nights a shape and texture that modern people rarely experience. It wasn't a flaw or a disorder, but a harmony with nature and faith, a pattern that tied body and spirit to the turning of the world. When you think about it, there's something deeply human about this rhythm, a balance between rest and reflection, silence and wakefulness. Perhaps in our own restless nights, we can find a small comfort in knowing that waking at midnight isn't new or strange. It's one of the oldest rhythms in human history, a quiet echo from the medieval world that still hums softly in our modern sleep. Privacy, as we know it today, was a rare luxury in the Middle Ages. The idea of having your own bedroom, or even your own bed, would have seemed strange to most people. In a world where homes were small, heating was scarce, and warmth was a matter of survival, sleeping together wasn't just common, it was essential. Families, servants, travelers, and sometimes complete strangers all shared sleeping spaces, often side by side, and this closeness shaped how medieval people experienced the night. In the average peasant household, space was precious. Many lived in single-room cottages, with animals kept under the same roof to provide warmth and protection. The hearth burned at the center of the room, giving both light and heat, and around it, people would arrange themselves to sleep. Parents, children, and sometimes grandparents would settle down together on straw or wool-stuffed mattresses, wrapped in rough blankets or animal skins. There were no separate beds, and certainly no doors to close for privacy. The family slept as a unit, not out of affection alone, but out of necessity. The shared body heat made the cold nights bearable, and the nearness provided a sense of security in a dark, uncertain world. Even among wealthier households, the sleeping arrangements might surprise you. In castles or large manor houses, the lord and lady would have their own bed, often raised and curtained for warmth and modesty. But servants frequently slept nearby, sometimes on pallets at the foot of the bed or even on the floor. Privacy was limited, even for the nobility. A person's bed was a place of rest, but also of business, conversation, and ceremony. Lords might receive guests or conduct affairs of state while reclining, with attendants standing nearby. Sleep was woven into the social fabric of daily life, not separated from it. In inns and taverns, sleeping together with strangers was the norm. Travelers on long journeys couldn't expect their own rooms. Instead, they would pay for a spot in a shared bed or on a straw pallet beside others. Men and women, merchants and peasants, might find themselves sleeping side by side, though usually separated by class or gender if possible. For many, it was a strange but necessary part of life. Complaints about snoring, fleas, and body odor were common, but so too were stories of late-night conversations and unexpected friendships formed in these communal spaces. There's a famous example from England in the 15th century that captures this perfectly. In one account, a traveler described sharing a bed with a stranger and waking to find the man gone and his purse with him. Bed sharing could bring companionship, but also risk. Trust was both essential and fragile. Still, with few inns and limited resources, people accepted the arrangement as ordinary. The warmth of another body was preferable to the cold of an empty bed in a drafty room. Sleeping together also reflected the medieval understanding of community. Life was collective. Families worked, ate, prayed, and slept together. The night was not a time to retreat into solitude, but to huddle close and share space. Children grew up accustomed to the rhythms of adult life, hearing whispers, prayers, and sometimes the more intimate sounds of marriage through the night. To modern ears, that might seem uncomfortable, but to medieval people, it was part of existence natural, even comforting. For the poor, bedding itself was often a mark of fortune. A family might share a single straw mattress laid directly on the floor, sometimes covered with old cloth or a sack to hold the straw in place. Over time, the straw would flatten and collect dust and insects, so it had to be replaced regularly. The smell of earth, sweat, and smoke lingered everywhere. The bedclothes might be simple wool blankets or patched linen sheets, though many slept under nothing more than heavy cloaks. The warmth of others made all the difference. In monasteries, communal sleeping took on a spiritual form. Monks slept in long dormitories, often arranged in rows of simple wooden cots. They were expected to maintain silence, rising at the sound of the bell for midnight prayers. The closeness reinforced their shared faith and discipline. Sleep was never purely physical. It was bound up with duty, humility, and the surrender of the self to God's rhythm. The same could be said for nuns, whose dormitories were often cold, dim, and orderly, symbols of their devotion and separation from worldly comfort. For children, sharing a bed with siblings or parents meant security. The dark could be terrifying, in an age filled with stories of spirits and demons that haunted the night. A child might cling to a parent or a brother for safety. The family bed was not just a place of sleep, but a storytelling, prayer, and whispered comfort. Parents would tell tales or recite psalms as the fire dimmed, soothing restless minds until sleep came. In larger towns and cities, space remained limited, and lodgers often shared rooms with unrelated families. The sound of snoring, coughing, or the shuffle of feet was part of every night. Even the wealthy, though better housed, couldn't escape the sense that night belonged to everyone. Servants would move through the rooms tending fires or fetching water, and privacy was rare. The idea of locking oneself away to sleep alone simply didn't fit the medieval world. This closeness had social consequences. It taught cooperation, trust, and tolerance, but it also blurred boundaries between personal and communal life. People were used to the presence of others at all times. They saw the body as practical, not private, and sleep as a shared human need rather than a personal retreat. So, when you picture the medieval night, imagine not the silence of a solitary room, but the warmth and noise of shared sleep. The crackle of a low fire, the sighs of family members shifting in the dark, the occasional murmur of prayer, or the shuffle of an animal nearby. It was a world where intimacy and necessity met, where the night bound people together as surely as daylight did. In those crowded rooms and shared beds, sleep wasn't just rest, it was community. To a medieval villager, the line between human and animal life was far thinner than it is today. People and animals worked together, lived together, and often slept together. In an age before central heating, before insulated walls and double-paned windows, warmth was a matter of survival. It was perfectly ordinary to have animals, dogs, cats, pigs, even chickens sharing the same sleeping space as their human owners. This closeness wasn't always pleasant, but it was practical, and it tells us much about how medieval people saw the night. Most peasants lived in what were called longhouses, simple one-room dwellings, where humans and livestock shared the same roof. The floor might be packed earth, covered in straw or rushes, and at one end of the room, a small partition or raised area would separate the family's sleeping space from the animals. The heat from cows, goats, or pigs helped keep the chill away during cold months. It was a natural form of heating, one that turned the entire house into a living ecosystem of breath, body heat, and sound. Imagine lying down after a long day's labor. The fire has burned low, and the only light comes from the embers. You pull a coarse blanket over yourself, and just a few feet away, you hear the slow, steady breathing of your animals. The cow shifts in her stall, a pig snuffles softly in the straw, and a hen murmurs from her perch. These sounds were the lullabies of the medieval night, comforting, familiar, and part of the rhythm of life. Dogs were especially common companions in bed. Not only were they loyal protectors, but their warmth made them valuable sleeping partners. A dog curled at one's feet or side was a living heater. There's even an old phrase, a three-dog night, meaning a night so cold that you'd need 3 dogs in bed to stay warm. Cats, though less valued for their companionship, were still welcomed in sleeping spaces for their usefulness. They kept mice and rats at bay, and their presence in a house was often seen as both practical and lucky, though superstition could turn that luck depending on the color of the cat or the mood of the church. Of course, sleeping with animals came with its share of problems. Fleas, lice, and other pests were a constant nuisance. In fact, flea infestations were so common that many medieval people hardly remarked on them. The straw mattresses and animal hides that made up most bedding were natural habitats for insects, and the presence of warm-blooded animals only made matters worse. People scratched in their sleep, woke with bites, and sometimes burned their straw bedding to rid themselves of the worst infestations. Despite this, the practical benefit of warmth outweighed the discomfort. In noble homes, animals were still part of the night, though in a more refined way. Dogs and cats wandered freely through great halls and chambers, often sleeping at the foot of their master's bed. Wealthy ladies were known to keep small lapdogs as companions, treasured for their gentleness and warmth. Some even had special cushions made for them near the bed. Cats, despite their reputation for independence, were welcome for their hunting skills and quiet presence. Yet even in grand castles, the sounds of night were filled with life. The creak of wood, the scurrying of vermin, the distant whine of a hound in the courtyard. Farmers, on the other hand, relied heavily on the warmth and company of their livestock. In cold regions, a pig was considered one of the best bedfellows one could have. The animal, as thick body and natural heat, could make the difference between a shivering night and a bearable one. Children often slept closest to the animals, while adults took the slightly drier, higher side of the room. The mingling of animal smells, smoke, and damp straw was part of the sensory world of medieval sleep, a mix that today might seem unbearable, but then was as natural as breathing. There was also a spiritual dimension to this closeness. Animals were seen as part of God's creation, companions in the order of life. Their presence at night was a reminder of humility and dependence on nature. In stories and sermons, the sleeping peasant surrounded by his animals was sometimes used as a symbol of harmony with the earth. Yet there was always unease too, a sense that the boundary between the human and animal could blur. Folk tales often warned of animals that were not what they seemed, cats that were witches in disguise, dogs that sensed spirits, roosters that crowed to chase away the devil himself. Sleep, then, was never fully peaceful. It existed in a world alive with motion, sound, and breath. A dog might bark suddenly in the dark, startling the household. A goat might shift against the wall, waking a child. The fire could spit or flare, sending shadows crawling across the ceiling. But these were the textures of the medieval night, the small, familiar disturbances that made up the rhythm of living closely with animals and one another. Cleanliness was relative. Bathing was rare, laundry infrequent, and beds often unwashed. Still, there were attempts to keep some order. People shook out bedding in the mornings, beat straw mattresses to chase away insects, and hung blankets near the fire to dry and warm them. Herbs like lavender, mint, and rue were sometimes placed in the straw or under pillows to mask unpleasant smells and, according to belief, ward off pests and evil spirits alike. In winter, this shared warmth could be the difference between life and death. Frost crept through thin walls, ice formed on window ledges, and the hearth's heat faded quickly. To sleep alone in such conditions was dangerous. Together with family, with animals, under blankets and hides, people created small islands of warmth in a frozen world. So when we picture medieval sleep, it's worth remembering that beds were not silent or empty places. They were full of life, human and animal alike, bound together by the simple need to survive the cold. The medieval night wasn't still. It breathed. The warmth of a dog, the rustle of straw, the faint cluck of a chicken, these were the companions of a world that slept not in isolation, but in the shared heartbeat of all living things. When you picture a medieval bed, it's easy to imagine a grand four-poster draped in velvet and silk, the kind fit for a king or queen. But for most people, the medieval mattress was something far humbler, a rough sack stuffed with straw, wool, or reeds, laid directly on the floor or on a simple wooden frame. To sleep in the Middle Ages was to accept discomfort as a fact of life. Beds were functional, but rarely luxurious, and every material used told a story about class, climate, and custom. The most common bed for peasants was called a pallet, or straw tick, was made by stuffing a large canvas or linen sack with straw, hay, or reeds. The straw had to be replaced regularly, usually every few weeks, because it would flatten, turn dusty, and attract insects. Some families couldn't afford to replace it often, and old straw beds could grow musty, filled with fleas and mites that bit through the night. To freshen them, People would scatter aromatic herbs, lavender, rosemary, or sweet rushes inside the bedding. These herbs were thought to purify the air and keep pests away, though their effect was probably more soothing than protective. In wealthier homes, mattresses were thicker and filled with softer materials like feathers or wool. A feather bed was a prized possession, often handed down through generations. It was a sign of comfort and status, a symbol of wealth in a world where softness was a luxury. But even feather beds had their troubles. The feathers clunked, the covers grew damp in cold weather, and pests still found their way inside. Servants were responsible for beating and turning the mattresses regularly to keep them fresh. It was laborious work, but necessary if one hoped for a decent night's rest. The bed frame itself varied widely. Poor families might have none at all, sleeping on straw laid directly on the floor near the hearth. Others built crude wooden frames with ropes strung tightly across to support the mattress. These ropes sagged over time, so they had to be tightened regularly, a chore that gave rise to the old saying, "Sleep tight." The better the ropes were pulled, the more comfortable the bed. Nobles and wealthy merchants had elaborately carved frames, sometimes raised high off the ground to keep away from drafts and pests. Curtains hung from the posts to trap warmth and offer a rare bit of privacy. In castles and manor houses, the bed was not just a place to sleep, it was a statement. The canopy beds of the rich were covered in fine fabrics, embroidered linens, and sometimes even gold-threaded covers. They were built large enough to accommodate more than one person's spouses, children, or visiting guests. Servants might sleep nearby on benches or mats, always within earshot. Even with all the luxury, however, these beds were far from the comfort of modern ones. The air in stone rooms was cold and damp, and the fire might not last the night. Despite the wealth, the chill of the medieval world seeped in everywhere. For the majority of people, sleep was never free from interruption. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were constant companions. They lived in the straw, the blankets, even in the seams of the bed frames. People tried to fight them with ash, vinegar, and herbs, but there was no real cure. Cleanliness was difficult to maintain when water was scarce, and homes were smoky and sooty from open fires. To scratch in the night was as normal as breathing. Entire families might wake to pick at bites by firelight, resigned to the nuisance. Yet despite the discomfort, the bed had deep meaning. It was the heart of the home, the place of birth, rest, sickness, and death. Babies were born on those straw mattresses, the sick were tended there, and the dying gave their final prayers upon them. In many ways, a person's bed told the story of their entire life. When someone married, they often received bedding as part of their dowry or inheritance. A feather bed or fine blanket could be one of the most valuable things a household owned. People also treated their beds with a kind of reverence. Each night, prayers were said before lying down, asking for protection through sleep. The act of going to bed was not casual, it carried ritual weight. People crossed themselves, recited psalms, and asked for deliverance from bad dreams and evil spirits. Beds might be sprinkled with holy water on special occasions, or blessed by a priest if illness or death had touched the home. The physical bed was tied to the spiritual world, both comfort and vulnerability at once. The condition of one's mattress reflected the wider world of medieval inequality. A peasant's straw pallet was a world away from a noble's feather bed, yet both slept beneath the same stars, hearing the same wind against their walls. The night was a great equalizer in its own way, cold, dark, and filled with the same quiet dangers. Whether one slept on a pile of straw or under silk hangings, the body still needed rest, and the mind still wandered into dreams shaped by the same fears and hopes. Over time, as towns grew and craftwork improved, beds began to evolve. Artisans built stronger frames, and fabric makers wove finer sheets. By the late Middle Ages, even modest families might have linen sheets or wool blankets instead of coarse hemp. But the basic experience of sleep remained the same: rustic, imperfect, shared, and deeply human. So, when we imagine a medieval person lying down at night, it's not the smooth comfort of a modern mattress that greets them, but the rough rustle of straw, the faint itch of pests, and the warmth of family close by. It was a world where rest was a simple gift, earned through exhaustion, and where comfort was measured not by softness, but by survival. In the medieval world, night and darkness were inseparable from danger. Fire was both the greatest comfort and the greatest risk after sunset. It gave light, warmth, and security, but it could also destroy an entire home in minutes. Before electricity, the gentle flicker of a hearth or candle was the only way to keep the shadows at bay. To fall asleep safely meant balancing trust in the fire's warmth with fear of what it might do if left unattended. Nearly every home, from the poorest peasant's cottage to the grandest castle, revolved around the hearth. It was the center of life, where meals were cooked, stories were told, and prayers were whispered before bed. As night fell, the fire became a companion. Its soft glow was a comfort against the pitch black outside, a reminder that warmth still existed in a cold and uncertain world. But tending the fire was a skill, even an art. Too much flame, and sparks could leap into the thatch. Too little, and the home would grow freezing by midnight. Peasants were especially cautious. Their homes were often built of wood, straw, and wattle, all of which could catch fire easily. A thatched roof, dry and brittle, was particularly dangerous. To keep the fire alive but contained, people banked it before bed, covering the glowing embers with ashes to preserve the heat until morning. This slow, smoldering fire could be revived at dawn with a few puffs of air and new logs. To bank the fire was part of every night's ritual, a small but vital act of care before sleep. Candles and lamps played their own part in the medieval night. Made of tallow or beeswax, they were precious items, used sparingly. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, gave off a smoky, unpleasant odor, while beeswax candles, cleaner and longer burning, were reserved for the wealthy or for churches. A single candle could light an entire room, its soft glow casting long shadows on the walls. Yet that same candle, if knocked over, could spell disaster. Many fires began when people fell asleep with a candle still burning, its flame licking too close to a curtain or bedclothes. Because of this, bedtime routines often revolved around managing light. People would pray by the flicker of a candle, then carefully extinguish it before lying down. The darkness that followed was complete. Without moonlight or stars, the room became a cave of shadows and breath. In that deep stillness, every creak, rustle, or distant sound carried more weight. The fire's embers glowed faintly in the hearth, offering a dim reassurance that morning would come. In monasteries, the relationship with fire and light was deeply spiritual. Monks rose for prayers during the night, guided by lanterns or torches. Their routines were disciplined and cautious. Every candle watched closely. For them, the flame symbolized divine presence, a light in the darkness of the soul. Yet even in holy places, accidents happened. Chronicles record entire monasteries burned to the ground because of an untended candle or overturned lamp. Fire was sacred, but never safe. In towns and cities, the danger multiplied. Houses were packed closely together, often sharing walls. A single spark could spread from one home to another, consuming whole streets before anyone could react. Night watchmen patrolled with lanterns, calling out warnings and checking for smoke. Bells would ring if a fire broke out, summoning neighbors to form a bucket chain from the nearest well or river. Even then, once a fire took hold, there was little that could be done. People feared fire as they feared plague or famine. It was one of the constant terrors of medieval life. Despite the danger, light at night had deep symbolic power. Candles were lit not only for sight, but for meaning. They marked the hours of prayer, honored the dead, and guarded against evil spirits. A small flame beside the bed might be left burning as protection against nightmares or the wandering souls that were said to haunt the darkness. Some people believed that extinguishing all light invited bad luck, while others thought sleeping near a burning flame could draw spirits toward it. The boundary between practical caution and superstition was often blurred. In wealthier homes, servants managed the fire carefully. Large hearths burned in the great hall, while smaller braziers provided heat in private chambers. Even the nobility worried about fire. Thick curtains, wooden beams, and tapestries all posed a risk. At night, servants might sleep near the embers to tend them, keeping the heat alive through the long hours until dawn. The scent of smoke filled every room, a reminder of both comfort and vulnerability. The sound of a dying fire was part of the medieval lullaby, the soft crackle of coals, the hiss of sap, the occasional pop that echoed through the dark. It was a living thing, breathing quietly alongside the sleeping family. In the deep of winter, when frost gathered on windows and the cold crept under doors, the hearth became the only barrier between survival and the bitter chill. To lose the fire was to lose warmth, safety, and light itself. As people drifted into sleep, the fire's glow faded to embers, red and pulsing like a heart. Candles guttered out one by one, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and tallow in the air. The darkness settled thickly, pressing in from all sides, and the world grew still. In that darkness, medieval people found both fear and peace. The night was long, but the promise of light, of dawn, of flame, of life renewed, was always waiting. To sleep beside the fire was to trust it, to believe that it would guard you through the night. Every flicker, every shadow, carried the rhythm of life and death. Fire was danger, but it was also warmth. In its glow, families found comfort. In its absence, they found cold. And in its light, for one brief moment before sleep, they found the fragile safety that allowed them to close their eyes. When we imagine the medieval night, we often think of deep, peaceful silence, the kind of stillness that settles over a countryside untouched by modern noise. But for those who lived in the Middle Ages, nighttime was anything but quiet. The medieval world was alive with sound, even in darkness. Creaking timbers, barking dogs, tolling bells, restless travelers, and the constant murmur of animals created a kind of nocturnal symphony. It was a world that rarely slept completely, and those who lived in it learned to rest amid the noise. In small villages, the sounds of the night began as soon as the sun set. Chickens rustled in their coops, pigs shifted in their pens, and cows lowed softly from the other side of the wall. The wind rattled shutters, owls called from the trees, and dogs barked in the distance. Within the cottage, the sounds of family filled the air, snoring, coughing, whispered prayers, or the creak of straw under shifting bodies. The fire popped occasionally in the hearth, sending tiny sparks upward, and the faint sigh of wind through the cracks reminded everyone how thin the barrier between inside and outside truly was. Even the act of sleeping itself made noise. Beds were shared, straw mattresses rustled, and the uneven floors amplified every movement. In the colder months, people wrapped themselves tightly, their breathing mingling with the sound of sleeping animals. The constant noise of life was oddly comforting. To a medieval sleeper, silence would have been unsettling, even eerie. The absence of familiar sounds might mean something was wrong, perhaps a predator near the animals, or worse, an unnatural stillness that people might take as a bad omen. For those who lived in towns or cities, the noise only intensified. Narrow streets echoed with footsteps long after dark. Blacksmiths, bakers, and tavern owners often worked late, and the laughter of drinkers or the clash of mugs could be heard through thin walls. Horses clopped over cobblestones, carts rattled past, and stray dogs scavenged in alleys. The air was alive with the sounds of commerce and community, even as candles flickered out in nearby homes. Above all, the church bells marked the passing of time. They rang not only for prayer, but for curfew, for emergencies, and for the hour. Their echoes rolled across rooftops, blending with the night air, a reminder of faith and order in a restless world. Inns were especially noisy places. Medieval travelers rarely enjoyed solitude. Rooms were shared, beds were shared, and walls were often just thin planks or cloth partitions. You could hear everything: the snoring of the man beside you, the restless shifting of horses in the stable below, and the faint sound of music or arguments in the hall. Fleas and lice made their presence known, and the smell of sweat and ale hung in the air. Yet for many travelers, the noise was the sound of safety. It meant they were inside, away from the dangers of the road and the darkness outside. Churches, meanwhile, carried their own unique sound through the night. Monks and nuns followed strict schedules of prayer that included waking during the small hours, around midnight or before dawn. The ringing of church bells for these vigils echoed through villages, marking sacred time. Even if most people didn't rise to pray, they heard the bells and often whispered short devotions before turning over to sleep again. The sound was both familiar and holy, a rhythm that tied everyday life to the divine. Nature, too, had its voice. The countryside was full of nocturnal music, frogs croaking by rivers, crickets singing in the grass, wolves howling in the distance. Farmers could tell the hour by these sounds as much as by the stars. The owl's call, the crowing of the rooster, or the hush before dawn all marked stages of the night. People listened closely to the world around them, and those sounds became woven into their understanding of time. Of course, not all sounds were welcome. Thunderstorms terrified many, not just for their violence, but for their spiritual implications. Loud winds were thought to carry spirits or demons. When storms rolled across the land, people crossed themselves, prayed, and drew closer to the fire. The sound of hoofbeats outside could mean travelers or thieves. A baby's cry might stir a mother awake in panic, fearing illness or evil influence. Every sound had meaning, and people's ears were attuned to hear it. For wealthier households, the sounds of night were filtered but still present. The heavy curtains around their beds muffled the outside world, yet servants moved quietly through halls, tending fires or bringing chamber pots. The rustle of fabric, the click of wooden shoes, the soft scrape of doors, all of it filled the stillness. Even in castles, the air carried whispers and echoes. Sound traveled through stone corridors like a ghost, reminding everyone that even in luxury, the night belonged to no one. The noise of medieval nights also reflected community. In many towns, watchmen patrolled the streets, calling out the hour to show they were alert. All's well. They would shout into the darkness, their voices echoing through the narrow lanes. People lying in their beds would hear them and feel a small comfort, a reminder that someone was awake, watching over the sleeping city. In times of fire, flood, or attack, that same voice could turn to alarm, rousing the entire neighborhood in moments. For people of the Middle Ages, noise was not something to escape from. It was part of life itself. The night was alive, and those sounds were threads in the great fabric existence. They told stories, warned of danger, comforted the lonely, and filled the hours between dusk and dawn with texture and meaning. To sleep in that world was to surrender not to silence, but to sound. The rhythmic breathing of others, the soft lowing of animals, the faint toll of a bell in the distance, all of it blended into a kind of medieval lullaby. It was imperfect, sometimes chaotic, but deeply human. Beneath those sounds, the people of the Middle Ages found rest, just as we do now, rocked gently to sleep by the heartbeat of the world around them. For medieval people, sleep was never just a matter of rest. It was a passage, a mysterious journey into another realm, one that existed between the earthly and the divine. Dreams were not seen as random images or the result of the mind's wanderings. but as messages, warnings, and glimpses into the unseen world. To dream was to open a door, and what came through that door could be either holy or terrifying. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life, and dreams were no exception. The church taught that God could send visions to guide or warn the faithful, just as he had done in the Bible. Saints and prophets dreamed of angels, miracles, and divine instruction. Yet the same church also warned that the devil could whisper lies into dreams, leading souls astray. Every night, the sleeper entered a spiritual battlefield, where the forces of light and darkness vied for influence over the human heart. To dream was both a gift and a risk. People took their dreams seriously. A vivid dream might be shared with a priest or written in a journal, especially by scholars or monks. Books about dream interpretation circulated widely, blending Christian belief with ancient philosophy. One of the most popular was the Somnial Danielis, a dream dictionary said to be based on the visions of the prophet Daniel. It listed hundreds of possible dream symbols: snakes, crowns, fire, and water, each with its own meaning. A dream of flying might signify good fortune, while one of falling suggested sin or pride. Even the simplest dream could be seen as an omen, a message to be read carefully. But not all dreams were divine. Nightmares, or night terrors, were thought to come from darker forces. The term nightmare itself originates from the Old English word mare, meaning an evil spirit that sat upon a sleeper's chest, suffocating them. People truly believed such beings existed. They described waking in the dark, unable to move, feeling a crushing weight on their chest, and sensing an invisible presence. Today we call this sleep paralysis, but to a medieval mind, it was a demonic visitation. The mare was one of many supernatural beings said to haunt the night, along with witches, restless souls, and demons that preyed upon the vulnerable sleeper. To ward off these evils, people used prayers, charms, and protective symbols. A crucifix might be hung near the bed, or a sprig of blessed herbs placed beneath the pillow. Some recited specific verses before sleep, asking for angels to guard their dreams. In certain regions, it was believed that sleeping with a Bible under the head could keep nightmares away. Children were taught to make the sign of the cross if they woke frightened, for even their dreams were thought to have moral weight. Dreams also connected deeply with the rhythms of everyday life. Farmers dreamed of weather and harvests, sailors of storms and calm seas, lovers of messages from those far away. People read meaning into everything. A dream of clear water was seen as purity or good health, while muddy water might foretell illness or trouble. Dreams about bread, animals, or fire were interpreted through both faith and folklore, blending wisdom passed down through generations. Monks and scholars debated the nature of dreams. Some believed they reflected divine will. Others saw them as products of the body and the humors. According to medieval medicine, dreams could reveal one's health. A restless or fearful dream might be caused by eating too heavily before bed, while calm dreams came from a balanced soul and diet. Physicians advised moderation in food and drink to ensure peaceful sleep, suggesting that the body and spirit were always intertwined in the mystery of the night. In art and literature, dreams became powerful symbols. Medieval poets wrote of dream visions where they met saints, lovers, or allegorical figures who revealed truths about life and salvation. These dream poems were not mere fantasies. They were reflections of a culture that believed the night could speak. To fall asleep was to open oneself to revelation, and waking was to return changed, carrying fragments of another world. Yet not all encounters in the night were welcomed. Tales of demonic seducers, incubi, and succubi spread across Europe. These spirits were said to visit sleepers, causing temptation or torment. People believed that moral weakness or unconfessed sin could invite such visitors. Nightmares became warnings not just of physical fear, but of spiritual danger. The bed, so intimate and private, was also a battleground of faith. Even the natural sensations of the night were interpreted through this lens. A sudden chill, a strange noise, or a flicker of candlelight could all be seen as signs of a presence unseen. People might wake and whisper a prayer, fearing that something had crossed the boundary between worlds. For them, the night was not empty. It was alive with both the divine and the demonic. Sleep was never just rest. It was participation in a cosmic struggle. Despite the fear, there was beauty in this belief. Dreams offered a sense of connection to God, to the spirit world, to the mysteries of life. In a world where death was near and daily life was uncertain, dreams provided meaning. They reassured people that life continued beyond the body, that there were messages to be heard even in sleep. When dawn finally broke, people often reflected on their dreams in the first light of morning. Some dismissed them as foolish fancy, others treated them as prophecy. Either way, dreams gave shape to the inner life of the medieval world, a place where imagination, faith, and fear merged into one. To close your eyes in the Middle Ages was to enter a sacred space. It was to drift between heaven and earth, body and soul, light and darkness. Every dream was a story, every nightmare a warning, and every morning a small resurrection from the mysteries of the night. Sleep, like every other part of medieval life, was shaped by class. The divide between peasant and noble, between those who labored and those who ruled, could be felt even in the quiet hours of the night. Yet, for all the luxury and wealth that the nobility enjoyed, the world of their sleep was not as comfortable as one might imagine. Beneath the silks and furs, the cold draughts still crept in, the candles still sputtered, and the same medieval fears of the dark and the unknown remained. For the average peasant, sleep was a necessity born of exhaustion. They slept when the day's work was done and rose with the first light. Their beds were made of straw, shared with family, and often close to the fire where it was warmest. But for nobles, sleep was a performance as much as a routine. The bed was a symbol of power, status, and even virtue. The way one slept reflected not only comfort but character, and the bedchamber itself was a stage upon which wealth was displayed. In castles and manors, the lord and lady's bedchamber was often the most decorated room in the building. It was large, with high ceilings and stone walls draped in tapestries to block drafts. The bed itself was massive, often raised high on a wooden frame, with carved posts and thick curtains that enclosed it like a small room. The mattress might be stuffed with feathers or down, and the sheets made of fine linen. Rich blankets of wool, fur, or velvet added layers of warmth. To lie in such a bed was to lie within luxury itself, yet the comfort was fragile. The stone beneath the finery was cold, and even the wealthiest homes had little defense against winter's chill. Servants played a major role in preparing a noble's sleep. Before bed, they would stoke the fire, warm the bedclothes, and sometimes even heat bricks or stones that were wrapped in fabric and placed at the foot of the bed. This simple act could make the difference between comfort and shivering through the night. They also ensured that candles were safely extinguished, and if the lord or lady wished to rise in the night, a servant might sleep nearby to assist. Privacy was rare even for the elite. A noble might have personal attendants, guards, and family members all within earshot. Bedtime itself was often ceremonial. Nobles might pray aloud or read from a devotional text before retiring. Some took small draughts of spiced wine or herbal infusions believed to calm the body and aid sleep. A lady might remove her jewelry and hairpieces with the help of her maid, while the lord changed from his formal garments into a long linen nightshirt. Sleepwear was simple compared to the elaborate clothing of the day, but the ritual of undressing was still part of the nightly rhythm. Despite the grandeur, comfort had limits. The great bedchambers of castles were often poorly insulated. Wind howled through cracks in the stone, and the damp air clung to everything. The heavy draperies and canopies weren't just for decoration. They were essential for trapping heat. A noble's bed was like a small tent, protecting against cold air, insects, and prying eyes alike. The soft glow of a single candle or the orange shimmer of the hearth provided the only light. When the fire died, darkness filled the space completely, and the world outside the curtains vanished. For nobles, sleep was also a matter of reputation. Moralists and preachers often warned against idleness or indulgence in long, lazy sleep. The wealthy were expected to rise early to pray, manage their estates, and set an example of discipline. Sleep was necessary, but too much of it was seen as a sign of weakness or sin. Nobles were often reminded that even kings must answer to God for how they spent their hours, including those spent in bed. Guests, too, played a role in noble sleep. Hospitality was a central virtue of medieval life, and visitors were often lodged within the same chambers or nearby. It wasn't unusual for several people to sleep in the same room, though the lord and lady had the most comfortable bed. In some cases, close friends or favored courtiers might even share the bed itself, a custom that symbolized trust and companionship rather than impropriety. The medieval bed was a social space, a place for conversation, counsel, and even diplomacy. Meanwhile, the differences between noble and peasant life were most stark in the details. Where peasants stuffed their mattresses with straw, nobles had feather beds. Where peasants shared a fire in a single room, nobles had servants to tend their hearths. Where peasants huddled with animals for warmth, nobles slept surrounded by fine fabrics and perfumes. Yet, beneath these contrasts, both faced the same basic truths of the night, the darkness, the cold, the vulnerability of sleep. Even kings could wake from nightmares, and even queens could fear the sounds that echoed in the stillness of the castle halls. Children of noble families sometimes slept in adjoining rooms or with nurses and servants nearby. Their beds were smaller versions of their parents', often adorned with fine linens and small icons of saints for protection. The wealthy believed strongly in safeguarding their sleep with symbols of faith crosses hung on the walls, relics placed by the bedside, or prayers written on parchment and kept beneath the pillow. Sleep was not only a physical act, but a spiritual one, watched over by both faith and fortune. It's easy to imagine that wealth insulated the nobility from hardship, but medieval nights had a way of humbling everyone. Cold seeped through walls, fires dimmed, and fears of illness or evil spirits visited rich and poor alike. In their great beds, nobles were still human, still dreamers, still vulnerable, still longing for warmth and peace like anyone else. The differences between noble and peasant sleep were measured not only in comfort, but in the meaning of it. For peasants, sleep was survival. For nobles, it was ceremony. Yet both shared the same rhythm of life, the same faith in prayer, and the same hopes whispered in the dark. Whether beneath silk curtains or rough blankets, every sleeper in the medieval world was bound by the same truth: the night came for all, and in sleep every soul was equal under the same silent sky. While most people in the Middle Ages ended their days in weary exhaustion, monks approached sleep as something far more deliberate, a spiritual duty, not just a physical need. For them, the night was not simply a time of rest, but part of the sacred rhythm that governed every moment of their existence. Monastic sleep was shaped by devotion, discipline, and the relentless pull between the body's weakness and the soul's yearning for God. Monks followed the rule of Saint Benedict, a set of strict guidelines written in the 6th century that became the foundation of Western monastic life. This rule dictated not only how to pray, eat, and work, but also how to sleep. In the Benedictine order, for example, monks were required to go to bed early, rise during the night for prayer, and wake again before dawn to begin their day. Their sleep was divided, much like that of the common people's first and second sleeps, but theirs was shaped by holy purpose. The day in a monastery began and ended with prayer. As night fell, the monks would gather in the chapel for Compline, the final prayer service of the day. It was a solemn, peaceful ceremony meant to prepare the soul for sleep and for whatever dreams or trials might come during the night. The words of the Psalms were recited softly, candles flickered against stone walls, and the echoes of chants filled the air like a lullaby of faith. When the service ended, the monks would bow to one another in silence and return to their dormitory. Their sleeping quarters were simple and communal. Dozens of monks might share a single long room, each with a narrow cot or straw mattress. The beds were lined up neatly, often separated only by small partitions or wooden frames. Privacy was seen as unnecessary and even dangerous. It could tempt the mind toward vanity or sin. The dormitory was dimly lit by oil lamps, and silence was absolute. Even turning in bed was done quietly, with reverence for the peace of the night. Sleep itself was seen as a spiritual act. The body rested, but the soul was meant to remain alert to God. Monks were instructed to sleep in their clothes, ready to rise at any moment for prayer. They lay on their backs or sides, never face down, and they were forbidden to use soft bedding. A hard bed was a form of discipline, a reminder that comfort belonged to the next world, not this one. If a monk was found sleeping through prayers or appearing too comfortable, he might be given extra penance or fasting as correction. In the middle of the night, a bell would ring for matins, the first of the nocturnal prayers. The monks rose in silence, dressed if they had removed anything, and filed into the church. The cold of the stone floors bit at their bare feet, and the air smelled of wax and incense. Some might still be half asleep, but their voices joined in low, steady chant. These hours, between midnight and dawn, were considered the holiest time to pray. The darkness of the world mirrored the soul's waiting for divine light, and to rise from bed was to resist the temptations of sloth and sin. After matins, the monks might return to their beds for a short second sleep before rising again for lauds, the prayer at dawn. Their nights were short and fragmented, yet this pattern was believed to purify both body and spirit. It trained the monks to treat rest as a form of obedience, not indulgence. In giving up uninterrupted sleep, they imitated Christ's own watchfulness and suffering, offering their weariness as an act of devotion. Not all monasteries were the same. Some orders, like the Cistercians, practiced even stricter austerity. Their dormitories were colder, their beds harder, and their nighttime prayers longer. Others allowed slightly more comfort, with woolen blankets and simple pillows. But all shared the same belief that sleep was not an escape from duty, but a continuation of it. Even in dreams, the monk was expected to remain pure and mindful, and waking in the night was a chance to battle temptation and renew faith. The monastery at night was a world unto itself. Outside, the countryside slept in darkness, but within those walls, the faint sound of chanting drifted through the corridors. The flicker of torches cast long shadows on stone arches. The sound of the bell echoed like a heartbeat in the still air. For the monks, this was not disruption, but rhythm, the sacred pulse of time itself. Lay brothers and servants who lived within the monastery followed similar patterns, though their lives were more practical. They too rose for prayer, but they often tended fires, prepared bread, or cared for animals before dawn. Their sleep, while shorter, was blessed by association with the monastic routine. Every hour of their rest and labor was considered part of the divine order, sanctified by repetition and purpose. For nuns, the pattern was much the same. In convents, the dormitories were kept simple, with plain wooden beds and few possessions. Silence was absolute. Their nights were filled with the same sacred interruptions: the bell for prayer, the chant in the chapel, and the quiet return to bed. Many nuns recorded dreams of angels or visions of light, which they believed were gifts from God. Their faith turned even sleep into a form of prayer. To modern eyes, such a lifestyle might seem exhausting. But for medieval monks and nuns, this balance of rest and devotion created a peace few outside the monastery ever experienced. They lived not by the rhythm of the sun or the body, but by the rhythm of eternity. Each night was a rehearsal for the soul's eternal rest, a quiet surrender to divine will, hour by hour, prayer by prayer. And when dawn came, and the first light touched the chapel windows, the monks rose again, not weary, but renewed. Their short sleep had served its purpose. In their eyes, every breath taken between darkness and light was another step closer to God. Midnight held a special kind of power in the Middle Ages. It wasn't simply a mark on the clock, but a threshold between two worlds, the waking and the sleeping, the living and the spiritual. In a time when darkness ruled half the day, and the flicker of firelight defined the boundary of safety, the hour around midnight carried deep significance. It was a time of quiet, of danger, of revelation, and of prayer. Medieval people believed that what happened at this hour could reveal truths unseen during the day, and that the soul was never more open to the unseen than in those dark, silent moments. To most ordinary folk, midnight was a time when the world held its breath. The fire had burned low, and the village lay under a heavy stillness, broken only by the sound of animals shifting in their sleep. But to those awake monks, watchmen, travelers, or the sleepless, it was a time of strange awareness. The air felt different, charged somehow, as if the world itself had grown thinner. Superstition and faith blended easily in such hours. People whispered that the dead wandered at midnight, that witches gathered for their secret rites, and that unseen spirits drifted through the air. To be awake at this time was to walk the line between safety and mystery. The Church, however, gave midnight a sacred meaning. For monks and nuns, the bell that rang in the dark called them to matins, the first prayer of the new day. In that moment, they believed they stood at the meeting point of earth and heaven. The rest of the world slept, but they kept watch for all humanity, their chants echoing softly through cold stone halls. The very act of rising at midnight symbolized victory over sloth and sin. While others gave themselves to rest, the faithful few kept vigil, lifting prayers into the darkness like faint stars. Medieval writers often spoke of midnight as the hour when the veil between worlds grew thinnest. Dreams were believed to reach their most powerful stage then, capable of carrying divine messages or demonic temptations. The mind, half awake and half asleep, was thought to be closer to the spiritual realm. A person who woke suddenly around midnight might take it as a sign, perhaps that their guardian angel had stirred them, or that an unseen danger needed their prayer. It was common to whisper a quick devotion before lying back down, asking for protection until dawn. For peasants, midnight was practical as well as mystical. Many followed the two-sleep pattern, rising naturally in the middle of the night. During that wakeful interval, families might tend to small tasks, stoking the fire, checking on animals, or fetching water. Some might talk quietly, share a bit of bread, or reflect on dreams. The silence of the night offered rare privacy in a world where every moment of the day was shared. There was something soothing about that pause, a calm before the second half of sleep. But for others, the hour brought unease. Thieves, wanderers, and those up to mischief often used the cover of midnight to move unseen. Stories spread of travelers meeting ghostly figures on the road or hearing footsteps behind them when no one was there. To protect themselves, people carried charms or recited prayers as they passed through dark places. The fear of the unknown gave birth to countless folktales of shadowy huntsmen, wandering spirits, and spectral animals that appeared only between midnight and dawn. In the countryside, farmers listened to nature's signs to tell the hour. The change in the wind, the call of an owl, or the silence before a rooster's first crow all marked the passing of midnight. For those who lived by the rhythms of the earth, this knowledge was instinctive. Without clocks, they felt time in their bones, guided by sound, temperature, and light. Midnight was when the world seemed suspended, waiting for morning's return. In towns and cities, the midnight hour took on a different meaning. Watchmen patrolled the streets, calling out the time to assure the citizens that all was well. Their shouts, "Past midnight and all's well," echoed through narrow lanes, bouncing off stone walls. To the families lying awake in their beds, those voices were both comfort and warning. Fire was the constant threat in crowded towns, and hearing the watchman's call was a reminder that someone was guarding against disaster. But in the darker corners of the city, others moved in secret. Tavern doors closed, smugglers and thieves took to the alleys, and the shadows came alive with unseen life. Religious belief gave the midnight hour its deepest resonance. It was said that Christ would return at midnight, like a thief in the night, catching the world unprepared. Many preachers reminded their congregations to live as if the midnight bell could toll at any moment. Waking suddenly at that hour might stir a moment of reflection, a whispered prayer for forgiveness, a thought of mortality. Midnight became not only a time of fear, but of repentance and hope. For those who lived within the walls of a castle or monastery, midnight was marked by ritual. Bells signaled prayer, candles flickered in long corridors, and voices chanted psalms in Latin. The deep tones of the bell resonated through the sleeping countryside, a sound both eerie and comforting. To some, it was a reminder of order in a chaotic world. To others, a haunting call that broke the silence of the night. Yet for all its mystery, midnight also carried simple beauty. In those hours, when even the wind seemed to rest, the stars shone brighter, and the world felt vast and untouched. For those who rose to pray, or simply to sit awake by the embers of the hearth, the moment carried peace. The noise of the day was gone, replaced by the soft rhythm of breathing and the crackle of coals. In that stillness, one could almost feel the heartbeat of the earth itself. The medieval midnight was both sacred and feared, a time when angels and demons were said to pass by, when prayers were whispered, and when dreams spoke their strange truths. To live in that world was to know the night not as an empty span of darkness, but as a living presence, full of meaning and mystery. And when the first faint light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, those who had watched or prayed through the midnight hour knew they had crossed something profound, a moment of transformation, where darkness gave way to light, and time itself seemed to hold its breath. For all their hard labor and long days, medieval people were no strangers to sleeplessness. Even in a world without glowing screens, electric light, or noisy cities, the human mind still wandered restlessly at night. Insomnia, though they didn't call it that by name, was a familiar affliction. But unlike today, when sleeplessness is treated as a medical condition or a sign of stress, in the Middle Ages it was seen through a mix of faith, superstition, and folk wisdom. To them, a sleepless night could be a sign of sin, sickness, or even the work of unseen spirits. The first response to sleeplessness was often prayer. People believed that restlessness might be the soul's unease, rather than the body's. If one could not sleep, it was thought best to turn the wakeful hours toward devotion. Many whispered the Lord's Prayer, or recited psalms in the dark, asking for peace of mind and the grace of rest. The Book of Hours, a devotional text kept by the wealthy and the wealthy, pious contained prayers specifically intended to be said at night. To pray instead of tossing and turning was not only spiritually useful, but comforting, a way of quieting the heart when sleep refused to come. Yet not all sleeplessness was treated as holy. Physicians of the time saw it as a sign of imbalance in the body's humors, the four elements of medieval medicine: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If someone lay awake for hours, unable to drift off, the cause might be an excess of heat in the heart, vapors rising from the stomach, or a melancholy humor disturbing the brain. Each imbalance required a different remedy. Some advised cooling the body with herbal tonics. Others recommended avoiding heavy meals before bed. Sleep, like health, was seen as a delicate balance, easily disturbed by food, emotion, or weather. Herbal remedies were common, and often passed down through generations. Warm milk, for instance, was believed to soothe the stomach and calm the spirit, a custom that still survives today. Chamomile tea was used to settle nerves, while poppy juice, lettuce water, and valerian root were prescribed to induce drowsiness. Medieval herbals books of plant medicine contain long lists of sleep herbs, including lavender, mandrake, sage, and hops. People placed small pouches of dried herbs beneath their pillows or burned them near the bed to invite sleep. The scent of lavender, rosemary, or mint was thought to purify the air and ease troubled dreams. For those troubled by nightmares or restless spirits, spiritual cures were just as important. A cross might be hung above the bed, or holy water sprinkled on the sheets. Some placed small relics or written charms under the pillow, inscribed with verses of Scripture. In certain regions, people even whispered blessings over their bedding before lying down, asking for protection against night visitants. The line between medicine and magic blurred easily in the medieval imagination. What mattered was not whether it worked scientifically, but whether it comforted the soul enough to allow rest. Diet, too, was thought to play a role in sleep. Physicians advised avoiding spicy or fatty foods in the evening, as well as alcohol in excess. A light meal of bread, vegetables, or milk was considered ideal before bed. Heavy feasting was believed to stir the blood and cloud the mind, making it harder to sleep peacefully. Monks were especially careful about this. They ate sparingly and followed set routines to keep their bodies and minds in harmony. A disciplined life, they believed, brought natural rest. For people who could afford it, physicians sometimes prescribed more elaborate remedies. A tonic might be made from honey, vinegar, and herbs, or a mixture of wine and poppy juice. Some treatments even included opium or mandrake, both potent sedatives, though dangerously addictive by modern standards. Those too poor for physicians relied on home cures and wisdom shared by neighbors. A warm bath before bed, though not common for peasants, was another recommendation for those who could heat enough water. The gentle warmth soothed sore muscles after a long day and helped ease the transition to sleep. But beyond physical remedies, sleeplessness was often seen as a test of character. A restless night could be interpreted as a moment of spiritual trial. People might ask whether their conscience was troubled, whether they had failed in prayer, or neglected confession. Some believed that the devil whispered to the sleepless, tempting them with sinful thoughts in the dark. To fight such temptation, one was told to rise from bed, light a candle, and pray aloud. The very act of resisting drowsy despair was seen as virtuous. In towns and villages, sleeplessness was sometimes a social experience. Those who couldn't rest might quietly visit neighbors during the watch, a middle period between first and second sleep. This was a natural time for reflection and gentle company. People talked softly, tended to small tasks, or sat by the hearth until they grew drowsy again. The presence of another person, the sound of a voice in the stillness, often worked better than any potion or herb. The medieval world, for all its discomforts, understood something modern life often forgets, that human connection itself can ease the restless mind. Superstitions surrounded sleeplessness as well. It was said that if you lay awake staring into the dark for too long, spirits might take notice and come to trouble you. To ward them off, one should turn the pillow 3 times or recite a prayer backward odd gestures that mingled faith with folk belief. Some believed that the direction of the bed mattered. Sleeping with one's head to the east brought peaceful rest, while to the west invited uneasy dreams. These customs, passed quietly through generations, gave people a sense of control over the mysteries of the night. Even with all their remedies, sleeplessness was sometimes simply accepted as part of life. The medieval body was ruled by natural rhythms, by light, by weather, by work. If one could not sleep, it was not a tragedy but a passing state, to be met with patience. The night was long, but dawn always came. people filled their wakeful moments with prayer, thought, and gratitude. In their stillness, they often found a peace that eludes many in the modern age. To be awake in the dark of a medieval night was to join countless others, monks in their chapels, watchmen in their towers, mothers soothing children, and wanderers under the stars. Sleeplessness connected them all, a quiet reminder that even in restlessness there could be grace. The world outside might have been cold and full of shadows, but within the small circle of firelight and faith, there was warmth enough to wait for sleep to come. In the medieval world, sleeplessness was more than an inconvenience. It was a condition that demanded remedy. People sought out cures from every corner of knowledge available to them. Medicine, faith, folklore, and sometimes pure superstition. To lose sleep was to lose health, balance, and even divine favor. The night was meant for rest, and if rest would not come, something body or spirit was believed to be out of harmony. Thus, an entire craft of sleep cures and potions emerged, filling kitchens, monasteries, and apothecaries with concoctions meant to soothe the restless and calm the heart. Herbal medicine was the foundation of medieval sleep remedies. Plants were seen as gifts from God, each created with purpose. Some calmed the mind, others cooled the body, and many were believed to guard the soul during vulnerable hours of the night. Physicians, monks, and wise women alike relied on their knowledge of herbs, mixing and boiling, steeping and grinding, until the right balance was achieved. A well-made sleeping draught was as much an art as a science. Among the most trusted herbs was poppy. The milky sap drawn from its seed pods, known as poppy juice, was prized for its power to ease pain and bring deep, dreamless sleep. It was often mixed with honey or wine to make it more palatable. Though potent, it was also dangerous, for too much could send the sleeper into eternal rest. In monasteries, where care for the sick was a sacred duty, poppy juice was administered with prayer and caution. It was both medicine and mystery, a reminder that healing could easily blur into harm. Another favorite was valerian root. Described in herbal manuals as a plant that causeth sleep and easeth the beating of the heart, it was often steeped in hot water and drunk before bed. Its earthy, musky scent filled many a medieval chamber. Chamomile, too, was beloved for its gentle effects. A tea made from its flowers was thought to calm not only the body, but also the spirit. Peasants might gather chamomile from meadows, dry it, and keep it for nights when their minds refused to settle. Other common sleep aids included lettuce water, made by boiling lettuce leaves until the liquid turned pale green, and syrup of violets, a sweet, cooling drink meant to soothe both throat and temper. Mint, rosemary, and lavender were used not only as potions, but as pillows. People sewed small sachets filled with dried herbs and placed them near their heads, believing the scent would lull them to rest and ward off nightmares. Wealthier households could afford costly imports like nutmeg, cinnamon, or saffron, which were added to warm milk or wine as luxurious bedtime tonics. For those who could consult a learned physician, the cures grew more complex. Medical texts advised balancing the humors, the four bodily elements believed to govern all health. Sleeplessness, they said, often arose from an excess of yellow bile, which produced heat and agitation. To counter this, cool and moist remedies were prescribed. A bowl of lettuce soup, a poultice of rose oil, and vinegar applied to the temples, or even the scent of sandalwood might be recommended. Physicians sometimes wrote recipes for sleeping oceans in beautiful Latin script, their ingredients measured by instinct more than precision. Some cures crossed into the realm of the mystical. It was believed that sleep could be encouraged by writing holy verses on parchment and placing them beneath the pillow. A charm against insomnia might include a prayer to Saint Dymphna, patron of mental peace, or to Saint Joseph, who is said to sleep in divine trust. Pilgrims who suffered from sleeplessness sometimes carried small relics, fragments of saints, bones, or pieces of blessed cloth, believing that their presence brought comfort and rest. Monks, who tended both body and soul, developed remedies that blended prayer with medicine. In monastery gardens, they cultivated herbs not only for healing, but for rest. Manuscripts from the period record recipes for potions of repose, combining ingredients like anise, honey, and wine with calming psalms recited during preparation. The belief was that a potion made with prayer was stronger, its power sanctified by intention. A monk might murmur verses from the Book of Psalms as he stirred, his voice blending with the soft sound of bubbling water. Some remedies sound strange to modern ears. People were told to rub their temples with oil of foxglove, or to drink a mixture of vinegar and crushed pearls. In parts of Europe, it was said that placing a slice of onion under the bed would draw away the hot vapors that caused sleeplessness. Another folk cure recommended stroking a cat before bed. Believing its calm presence absorbed a person's restlessness. Whether these methods worked or not, they brought comfort, a sense of ritual that calmed the anxious heart. Music and sound also had their place in medieval sleep medicine. Lullabies were not only for children, but for adults too. Gentle singing, the hum of a psalm, or the steady rhythm of a chant could ease the passage into sleep. Monks believed that chanting the same verses every night created harmony between body and soul, aligning the human rhythm with the divine. Even peasants, after long days of labor, might hum quietly by the fire until their eyes grew heavy. The bedchamber itself could be treated like a remedy. People were advised to keep it cool, clean, and lightly perfumed. In noble households, servants aired the bedding, burned herbs to clear the air, and sometimes scattered fresh rushes or flowers on the floor to scent the space. The atmosphere of sleep was considered sacred. The combination of warmth, fragrance, and prayer created an environment where rest could finally find its way in. At its heart, medieval sleep medicine revealed something timeless: the understanding that rest is not merely physical, but deeply emotional and spiritual. The remedies, whether they came from a monk's garden or a peasantess hearth, were acts of care, small gestures of faith in a world full of uncertainty. To drink a cup of chamomile tea, to whisper a prayer, to trust in the rhythm of one's heartbeat, these were all ways of surrendering to the night. And perhaps that is why so many of these ancient remedies endure. We still turn to herbs, warmth, and quiet when sleep escapes us. We still light candles and seek peace in small rituals before bed. The medieval world, though distant in time, understood something essential about rest: that sleep, like faith, cannot be forced and must be invited gently, one breath and one prayer at a time. To understand medieval sleep, one must picture two very different worlds. In one, a lord or lady lies beneath embroidered sheets, surrounded by velvet curtains and guarded by servants. In the other, a peasant family huddles together on straw by the fading light of the hearth, the air thick with smoke and the smell of animals. Both are part of the same medieval night, two versions of sleep, divided by wealth, yet bound by the same rhythms of darkness and dawn. For the peasant in a cottage, sleep was survival. The day began before sunrise, filled with labor in the fields, tending livestock, or working for a local lord. By nightfall, exhaustion pulled every muscle toward rest. The home was small, usually a single room made of wood or wattle and daub, its roof thatched with straw. There was no separation between kitchen, living space, and sleeping area. A hearth burned at the center of the room, providing both heat and light. Around it, the family slept together, parents, children, and sometimes even visiting neighbors or travelers. The floor was covered in rushes or straw, and bedding consisted of coarse blankets or cloaks. In winter, the fire was banked carefully before bed, glowing faintly through the night. The sounds of animals close by, dogs, chickens, maybe a cow or pig, created a strange comfort. The warmth of bodies was essential, for cold could be deadly. Peasants slept in their day clothes or simple linen shirts, sometimes wrapping themselves in wool or furs if they could afford them. The scent of smoke Sweat and straw filled the room, but it was home, and in that mix of smells and sounds, people found rest. Castles, on the other hand, told a different story. The walls were thick, the ceilings high, and every stone seemed to hold the cold. Despite their grandeur, medieval castles were rarely warm. Great fires roared in the main halls, but their heat reached only so far. Bedrooms were often drafty and damp, their chill seeping into even the richest bedclothes. Lords and ladies slept on massive wooden frames with feather beds and fine linens, but warmth still depended on heavy blankets and furs. The noble bedchamber was as much a symbol as a room. It was a place of status and ceremony, where visitors might be received, councils held, and alliances sealed. The bed itself, with its carved posts and thick curtains, was a display of wealth. Those curtains were practical as well as decorative. They trapped body heat and provided a rare sense of privacy. Servants often slept nearby, ready to attend their masters if needed. Even the wealthiest among them were rarely alone. The differences between castle and cottage were clearest in the details. In a peasant's home, light came from the fire or a tallow candle, if one was available. In a castle, beeswax candles glowed with a softer, cleaner light. The rich could afford oil lamps. Their steady flame reflected off polished brass or silver, while peasants fell asleep to the sound of crackling wood and night insects. Nobles heard the echo of footsteps on stone and the distant hum of guards outside their chambers. Yet for all the contrast, sleep was not entirely more comfortable for the rich. The vastness of a castle made it cold and lonely at night. The fire could not reach every corner, and the silence could feel eerie. The thick walls muffled sound so completely that the mind filled the emptiness with imagination footsteps in the corridor, whispers of servants, or even the sigh of ghosts, for castles were often believed to be haunted. It was said that noble families, who lived surrounded by wealth and worry, suffered more from nightmares and restless dreams than the poor who slept soundly from exhaustion. In cottages, sleep came quickly, but it was often broken. The fire needed tending, the baby cried, or the animals stirred. Peasants woke during the watch, that quiet hour between first and second sleep, to pray, talk, or share warmth. The night was long and lived communally. A family might rise to share a piece of bread, or a mother might whisper a prayer over her sleeping children. In this simplicity, there was an intimacy that the grandest castle could not replicate. The nobility, by contrast, followed routines of ritual and refinement. Servants prepared the bed, warmed it with stones, and hung perfumed sachets nearby. Nobles changed into nightclothes of fine linen, sometimes scented with herbs or oils. Before sleeping, they prayed beside the bed, often with a small crucifix or rosary in hand. Their sleep was not only rest, but a mark of divine favor, the peace of one whose soul and status were both secure. Still, fear lingered in even the finest chambers. Fire was a constant danger, and illness could strike regardless of wealth. Many nobles kept a candle burning all night as a symbol of faith and protection against the unknown. Both peasants and nobles believed in the spiritual vulnerability of sleep. To sleep was to surrender control, to open the mind to dreams and unseen forces. A poor family might whisper a prayer to keep away spirits, while a noble might rely on relics or holy charms. Despite their differences, both sought the same thing: safety in the dark. The medieval world, divided by class, was united in this nightly ritual of trust. In the morning, the two worlds woke to the same light. In cottages, the first sound was the stirring of animals and the crackle of rekindled fire. In castles, it was the footsteps of servants and the toll of chapel bells. Peasants rose to labor, nobles rose to govern. Yet for a brief time, before the day began, both had known the same darkness and the same human need to lie down, close their eyes, and surrender to sleep. The contrast between castle and cottage reminds us that comfort is not the same as peace. The poor slept surrounded by family and warmth, the rich by walls and silence. Each dreamed according to their life, one of toil, one of power, but both were bound by the same fragile rhythm of night and dawn. The stars that shone over a noble's tower were the same that glimmered above a peasant's thatched roof. And under those stars, every soul in the medieval world met the same simple truth. In sleep, all were equal. In the medieval world, a bed was far more than a place to rest. It was a statement of wealth, power, and even moral standing. The way a person slept and what they slept on spoke volumes about who they were. A bed was not just furniture. It was a stage upon which the rituals of life and death unfolded, and in many ways it became a symbol of the self. From the humblest straw pallet to the grandest canopy bed, the medieval bed told a story about class, comfort, and the human desire for dignity, even in sleep. For peasants, a bed was a simple necessity. Most had only straw mattresses stuffed into sacks of rough linen or hemp. Some slept directly on the floor or on piles of rushes, replaced only a few times a year. Bedding was precious. If a family had a blanket or a sheepskin, it was treasured and used by everyone. The bed was not a private space, but a shared one, a corner of the home where warmth was preserved and daily exhaustion finally gave way to rest. There was little distinction between day and night furniture. The same space used for eating or working might serve as a sleeping area by evening. But in noble households, the bed transformed into an object of prestige. It became the centerpiece of the chamber, elevated both physically and symbolically. A noble's bed could be enormous, built of oak or walnut, carved with intricate patterns and family crests. Curtains of silk or velvet enclosed it like a throne, shielding the sleeper from drafts and prying eyes. The bedding itself was a display of wealth sheets of fine linen, blankets trimmed with fur, and embroidered covers worked with gold thread. Even pillows were a sign of luxury, since many people in the Middle Ages slept without them altogether. Owning such a bed was not only a matter of comfort, but of honor. Inventories from the period show that beds were often listed among a noble's most valuable possessions, alongside land, jewels, and armor. When a noble family moved from one castle to another, they took their bed with them. It was portable wealth, a mark of identity that traveled wherever they went. In some cases, it was even used in legal documents as a symbol of inheritance, the passing down of not just property, but lineage and legacy. The bedchamber itself served multiple purposes beyond sleep. It was both private and public, a place where intimate and official matters mingled. Lords and ladies often received guests while reclining in bed, a practice inherited from Roman custom. Courtiers, advisors, and even priests might gather around the bed to discuss politics, business, or confessions. The act of lying in bed before one, his peers did not carry the intimacy it does today. It was a symbol of power, of being at ease while others stood in attendance. The bed was, in a sense, a throne of repose. Ceremonies of life and death also centered around the bed. Marriages were blessed at the bedside, and children were born upon its linens. The sick were tended there, and the dying gave their final words from it. Deathbeds were moments of immense spiritual importance. Priests would arrive to anoint the dying, candles would be lit, and family members would gather to pray. The bed was where one met God, where the soul prepared to cross into eternity. For this reason, it carried not just social weight, but sacred significance. Among the wealthy, the materials and colors of the bed spoke of status. Blue and gold were favored by royalty, while deep red symbolized nobility and strength. Embroidered scenes might tell stories of saints or family legends. Some beds were so elaborate that they took months to construct. Skilled artisans crafted the frames, while seamstresses and embroiderers worked on the fabrics. In France and England, the most opulent beds became heirlooms, named and celebrated in family histories. To sleep in such a bed was to be surrounded by generations of pride. Meanwhile, for the middle classes merchants, minor officials, and prosperous craftsmen, the bed became a symbol of aspiration. Their homes often featured one fine bed, placed in the main room, both practical and showy. Visitors could see it, admire it, and understand that this was a household of success. The bed was kept clean and carefully made, its blankets folded with care. It represented not indulgence, but respectability, a visible marker of order and discipline. The church, however, sometimes viewed luxurious beds with suspicion. Preachers warned against soft living, reminding nobles that excessive comfort could weaken the soul. Sermons spoke of Christ, who had no place to lay his head, and urged humility even in rest. Yet the allure of comfort was strong. The wealthy justified their beds as reflections of God's blessings, seeing beauty and craftsmanship as forms of devotion. Monks, by contrast, embraced simplicity, sleeping on bare boards or straw, wrapped in their habits to remind themselves of the fleeting nature of earthly pleasure. Despite the contrasts, every bed, rich or poor, was a kind of sanctuary. It was where people felt safest, where they whispered prayers and trusted that morning would come. The peasant's straw mattress, the merchant's neatly made pallet, and the noble's curtained canopy all served the same purpose: to cradle the body and rest the soul. Perhaps the greatest irony of the medieval bed was how little it could truly separate one class from another. For all their wealth, the noble's sleep was no deeper, their dreams no purer, than those of the poorest farmer. Both faced the same darkness, the same frailty of the human body, and the same hope of waking to another dawn. In that way, the bed was both a symbol of division and of unity. When dawn's light slipped through cracks in a thatched roof or through the embroidered curtains of a castle chamber, it touched rich and poor alike. And as the sleepers stirred, stretching and yawning, they shared in something timeless, the renewal that comes after rest. The medieval bed, for all its grandeur or simplicity, was a place where life's greatest equalizer, sleep, worked its quiet, leveling magic. When the sun dipped below the horizon in the Middle Ages, the world changed. Darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was a realm of uncertainty, danger, and superstition. The night belonged to thieves, spirits, and beasts. For ordinary people, it was safer to stay indoors, close to the fire, with doors barred and prayers whispered. But someone had to walk the streets, to keep the peace and sound the alarm if trouble came. Those men were the night watchmen, the guardians of sleeping towns, patrolling through a world that most dared not enter after sunset. In medieval towns and cities, the role of the night watchman was both vital and thankless. Streets were narrow and unlit, and the glow of a single lantern could only reach a few paces ahead. Watchmen carried torches or lamps, cudgels for defense, and sometimes horns or bells to call for help. Their duty was simple in theory: to protect life and property, prevent fires, and ensure that curfew laws were obeyed. But in practice, it meant facing the worst the night had to offer: drunkards, criminals, and the eerie silence of streets that seemed alive with unseen movement. The curfew bell, rung each evening, signaled that fires must be covered and citizens should return home. After that, anyone found wandering without good reason risked being arrested or questioned. Watchmen patrolled slowly, calling out the hours to show they were awake. Past 10 o'clock, and all's well. Their voices would echo through the winding lanes. Those words offered comfort to those inside, listening in the dark. They meant that someone was out there keeping watch, standing between the sleeping city and whatever shadows might creep in. Fire was the greatest fear of medieval towns. Wooden buildings stood close together, their thatched roofs dry as tinder. One stray ember could destroy an entire street. Watchmen listened for the crackle of flames and sniffed the air for smoke. If they saw a glow or smelled burning, they would sound their horns or ring the bell to rouse the neighborhood. Men would rush from their homes, forming bucket chains from wells or rivers. But in the precious minutes before help arrived, it was often the watchmen who risked their lives trying to contain the blaze. Beyond fire, the night hid many other dangers. Thieves and pickpockets prowled after dark, knowing that most honest folk were asleep. Traveling at night was perilous. Roads were unguarded, and robbers lurked near bridges and forests. Even within city walls, safety was uncertain. Without light, it was easy to become lost or ambushed. Watchmen knew the alleys and corners where trouble liked to hide. Their voices, firm and steady, were sometimes enough to drive mischief away, but not always. There were tales of watchmen vanishing on their rounds, or being found robbed and beaten by morning. Superstition also filled the night. Many believed that ghosts and demons roamed freely after midnight. The watchman, more than anyone, walked among those fears. The sound of wind whistling through an empty street could make even the bravest heart uneasy. A sudden noise, the rustle of cloth, or the cry of a cat might feel like an omen. Some watchmen carried charms or blessed tokens for protection. Others whispered prayers as they walked, their breath visible in the cold air. For them, the night was not just a physical challenge, it was a spiritual one. In rural villages, the duties of the watch fell to local men, chosen by turn. They might not be trained or well armed, but they knew every face in their community. Their presence discouraged strangers and offered reassurance. Often, they patrolled in pairs for safety. The creak of their wooden shoes and the flicker of their lanterns were familiar sights in the darkness. To see them pass by was to feel a little less alone. In larger cities, like London or Paris, organized watches became more formal. As city gates were locked at sunset, and patrols were set in motion. The watchman's cry marked each passing hour, blending with the distant toll of church bells. Inns closed their doors, merchants barred their shops, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Behind shuttered windows, people listened to the sounds of boots on cobblestones and felt the fragile safety of the sleeping city. Despite their importance, watchmen were often poorly paid and poorly regarded. Their work was dangerous and lonely, and many were older men or those unable to do heavier labor. Some drank on duty to keep warm or to calm their nerves. There are records of watchmen being scolded for falling asleep in doorways or for joining the very thieves they were meant to stop. Yet for all their flaws, they stood as the last line between order and chaos, between the safety of home and the uncertainty of the night. Outside the cities, the dangers were different. Wolves and wild dogs sometimes prowled near villages, drawn by livestock or the scent of refuse. Travelers on country roads risked far more than thieves. There were tales of wandering bandits, of spirits that led people astray, and of lights that danced in the marshes. Many carried lanterns and holy charms, whispering the names of saints to protect themselves as they walked through the darkness. To spend a night on the road alone was an act of courage or desperation. Even in castles, night brought unease. Guards kept watch from towers and gatehouses, listening for the distant cry of an owl or the sound of movement below. A torch flaring in the courtyard, a dog barking at the wind, a whisper from the ramparts, all these small noises carried meaning. Night was a living thing, full of secrets and danger, and those who kept watch were its silent witnesses. For the people who slept behind barred doors and shuttered windows, the watchman's rounds were a kind of prayer made real. Their footsteps in the night meant that the world still had order, that someone was guarding against the unknown. When they cried, "All's well," they were not only marking the hour, they were soothing the fears of 1,000 unseen souls lying awake in their beds. To live in the Middle Ages was to live close to the edge of darkness. The night could not be tamed, only endured. And so, as families slept, the watchmen walked steady, lonely, and brave, carrying their small circles of light through a vast shadowed world. As medieval Europe grew from scattered villages into bustling towns and cities, the rhythm of sleep began to change. Urban life introduced new sounds, new routines, and new pressures. The slow, natural pace of rural living gave way to the hum of commerce and community. Streets that once fell silent after sunset now glowed with the faint light of candles and torches. People stayed awake longer, and the timeless quiet of the countryside night was replaced by a chorus of footsteps, chatter, bells, and trade. With this transformation, the way people slept and thought about sleep shifted in ways that shaped the centuries to come. In the early Middle Ages, life revolved around nature. The sun dictated waking and sleeping. The seasons set the pace of work and rest. But as cities expanded, artificial light and social gatherings stretched the day beyond its natural limits. Taverns stayed open later, artisans worked by candlelight, and night markets appeared in larger towns. People began to divide their time less by sunlight and more by human activity. The coming of urban life brought a subtle but lasting disruption to the ancient cycle of first and second sleep. In the countryside, darkness came like a curtain. Once the fire was banked and the candles out, there was little reason to stay awake. But in cities, night became a time of opportunity. The wealthy attended feasts or gatherings that lasted deep into the night, while craftsmen and traders often worked after dark to meet demand. The sounds of hammers, carts, and voices echoed through the narrow streets. Even the glow of candles in windows gave towns an energy unknown to rural villages. For many, this new liveliness made the night both thrilling and dangerous, a time when rules blurred and the ordinary world transformed. This change affected how people rested. The traditional two-sleep system, falling asleep at dusk, waking for an hour or two in the middle of the night, and then returning to bed, remained common among rural folk, but in cities it began to fade. The long stretches of uninterrupted activity made the night shorter, compressing sleep into one block closer to what we now consider normal. The city's noise and light disturbed natural rhythms, and people adapted, sleeping later and rising later, especially in wealthier households where labor did not dictate the day's start. With urbanization came an entirely new form of noise. Church bells rang at all hours to mark time or call to prayer. Dogs barked, carts rattled over cobblestones, and late-night revelers sang or argued in the streets. Inns were full of travelers, whose comings and goings added to the din. The night watch called out the hours, their cries echoing through the alleys. For those trying to sleep, these sounds were impossible to escape. Windows were few and thin, shutters did little to block the noise, and the city's energy seemed to seep into every wall. Sleep became lighter, more restless, and less certain. Even the concept of privacy began to shift. In the countryside, families slept communally, often in one room. In towns, as homes grew larger and more complex, people began to carve out small spaces for themselves. Merchants might have separate chambers above their shops. Apprentices might share cramped lofts. The wealthy built private bedchambers with heavy doors and curtains, seeking quiet amid the city's chaos. Sleep became something to protect and preserve, a personal retreat from the noise and bustle of urban life. The church adapted as well. With more people living close together, nighttime prayers and vigils took on new forms. Some churches stayed open late, lit by candles for those seeking peace in the midst of noise. Monks and friars moved into cities, bringing with them the ancient rhythm of prayer that had once ruled the countryside. But even their discipline bent slightly to the pulse of the towns. The bells that once marked sacred hours now also regulated work, curfew, and civic order. The night no longer belonged entirely to God. It belonged to the city. Along with new patterns of activity came new dangers. Darkness in crowded towns was fertile ground for crime. Pickpockets, gamblers, and thieves found easy prey among the streets and taverns. The watchmen could not be everywhere at once, and people learned to keep close to their homes after dark. Candles and lamps burned later into the night, their glow visible through the cracks of shutters. Families whispered prayers for safety before blowing them out, knowing that just beyond their doors, the city never truly slept. Merchants and scholars began to describe the night differently. Instead of fearing it as a time of evil and rest, they began to see it as useful time, a chance for study, writing, or quiet labor. The growing class of literate townsfolk took advantage of candlelight to read and think long after sunset. In their diaries and letters, they spoke of the strange stillness of the late hours, when the city's din softened and the mind seemed sharper. For some, sleeplessness became not a curse, but a kind of gift of private space for thought in a crowded world. With this shift, sleep itself slowly lost its communal and spiritual nature. In the countryside, to sleep was to join the rhythm of the earth and the will of God. In the city, it became an individual experience, something to schedule, to manage, and sometimes to sacrifice. Productivity began to take precedence over rest. As trade and craft grew, the night became an extension of the day. The quiet hours once devoted to dreams and prayer now made room for work and profit. The soul's rest gave way, little by little, to the demands of the marketplace. And yet, even in the cities, remnants of the old world remained. The toll of the midnight bell still marked sacred time, and families still whispered bedtime prayers. The smell of smoke, the creak of beds, the warmth of shared blankets, all these persisted, linking the new urban life to its rural past. The heart of sleep, even amid change, remained the same. The need to withdraw from the noise, to close one's eyes, and to surrender to the stillness that waits behind the busy world. By the late Middle Ages, sleep was already evolving toward modern patterns. Artificial light had extended the day, commerce had reshaped time, and the human body had adapted. But the memory of the old ways lingered. The peasants who moved to the towns carried with them their habits of early sleep and midnight waking. In that mingling of old and new, the medieval city learned to live between two worlds, half in the ancient rhythm of nature, and half in the restless hum of human invention. The coming of urban life didn't end the medieval night, but it transformed it. The still, starlit darkness of the village gave way to the flicker of candlelight in crowded streets. The night no longer belonged solely to fear or faith. It belonged to people awake, alive, and shaping a new kind of world where even the act of sleep was beginning to change. For centuries, the people of medieval Europe lived by the rhythm of the two-sleep system, a natural pattern shaped by darkness, firelight, and the turning of the seasons. First sleep came after dusk, followed by a gentle waking in the middle of the night for prayer, reflection, or quiet activity, and then second sleep carried the sleeper through to dawn. This pattern had guided generations, linking body and soul to the steady flow of nature. But as time passed and the world changed, that rhythm began to fade. By the end of the Middle Ages, the ancient habit of segmented sleep was slowly vanishing, replaced by something far more familiar to us today, a single, unbroken stretch of rest. The decline of the two-sleep tradition was not sudden. It began quietly, as new inventions, social habits, and technologies reshaped the experience of night itself. The first and most powerful force behind this change was light. For thousands of years, the cycle of day and night ruled human life absolutely. Darkness dictated rest. Light meant activity. But as candles, oil lamps, and eventually torches became more affordable and widespread, people began to stay awake longer. The hours after sunset no longer belonged solely to sleep. They became hours for conversation, work, and leisure. In cities, this change happened first. Urban life thrived after dusk. Merchants counted coins, scholars studied by candlelight, and taverns filled with laughter and song. Even the poorest could now afford a small tallow candle to keep the night at bay. The once sacred stillness of darkness began to vanish beneath the steady flicker of human flame. People went to bed later, and as bedtime moved closer to midnight, there was less time for a waking interval between two sleeps. The first and second sleeps began to merge naturally into one continuous rest. The rise of the mechanical clock also played a quiet but profound role. In the medieval countryside, time had flowed with the sun and the seasons. In towns, it now ticked in steady, measured hours. Church bells rang on schedule, markets opened and closed by the clock, and life itself became more regimented. The natural rhythms that once guided sleep were replaced by human order. Waking in the middle of the night began to seem less like a normal pattern and more like an interruption. Time no longer belonged to nature, it belonged to work. The growth of commerce and industry accelerated this change. In earlier centuries, the peasant's day began with dawn and ended with dusk, dictated by daylight. But as trade expanded and workshops filled the towns, artificial light allowed labor to continue long after sunset. Craftsmen, bakers, and apprentices often worked late into the night. Sleep became something to fit around human schedules, rather than the other way around. The idea of rising at midnight for quiet reflection no longer fit into the rhythm of a city that never truly slept. Religion, too, evolved. The church had once encouraged nighttime prayer as part of the soul's discipline, but as devotion became more structured and less spontaneous, ordinary people prayed at set times rather than following the call of their own waking hours. The ancient practice of the midnight vigil survived mainly in monasteries. For the rest of society, it faded with the rise of convenience and order. The spiritual stillness once found in the middle of the night gave way to a new sense of purpose in the day. By the early modern period, writers and physicians began to describe sleep as a single, continuous block of time. The old terms, first sleep and second sleep, started disappearing from everyday speech. What had once been universal became a curiosity. Even so, echoes of the old pattern lingered in language and habit. People still spoke of watching in the night or taking to bed early, phrases that recalled the time when waking after midnight was as normal as dawn itself. It is tempting to imagine that the shift to one long sleep was purely progress, a triumph of civilization over nature. Yet something was lost in the transition. The quiet hours between first and second sleep had been a time of peace and intimacy, a rare space for thought, prayer, or gentle connection. Couples spoke softly by the dying fire. Parents whispered to their children, and solitary souls reflected on their dreams. The night offered a balance between wakefulness and rest that allowed for both contemplation and renewal. As people began sleeping straight through, that reflective space vanished. There were practical losses, too. The two-sleep system had allowed flexibility in a world without alarm clocks or rigid work schedules. A farmer could rise to tend animals or stoke the fire without disturbing the natural cycle of rest. With continuous sleep came the expectation of sleeping through, and waking in the night began to be seen as a problem rather than a normal occurrence. Over time, doctors started treating sleeplessness as an ailment instead of a variation in rhythm. What was once ordinary became pathology. Historians studying letters and diaries from the late medieval and early modern periods have found countless clues to this change. In the 15th century, people still wrote of first sleep and rising at the watch. By the 17th century, those phrases were rare. The Industrial Revolution would later seal the transformation completely, forcing the human body to conform to mechanical time. The glow of lamps and factory lights replaced the moon and stars, and sleep was pressed into a narrow window between labor and dawn. The night became smaller, and with it, humanity's ancient intimacy with darkness began to fade. And yet, traces of the old rhythm remain hidden within us. Modern sleep studies show that if people are kept away from artificial light for long enough, their bodies often return naturally to the pattern of two sleeps. We are creatures of twilight as much as daylight, shaped by thousands of years of living in rhythm with the dark. Somewhere deep within our biology, The memory of the medieval night still lingers, the quiet waking, the whisper of firelight, the gentle return to dreams. The decline of the two-sleep tradition marked the beginning of a new relationship between humanity and the night. Darkness ceased to be a companion and became something to overcome. But perhaps, in remembering how our ancestors slept slowly, deliberately, and in harmony with the natural world, we can glimpse a lost wisdom. The night, once divided between wakefulness and rest, offered balance. In its soft silence, people found not just sleep, but reflection, faith, and peace. As the medieval world gave way to modernity, the two-sleep rhythm faded into history. Yet the body remembers. Even now, when we wake at midnight and lie still in the dark, we are echoing an ancient pattern and instinct older than the clock, older than the city, older than time itself. As our journey through the medieval night comes to an end, it's worth pausing to consider what we've truly lost. We may live in a world brighter, safer, and more comfortable than any our ancestors knew, but in the glow of our endless light, something ancient and human has dimmed. The people of the Middle Ages, for all their hardships, lived in harmony with darkness. They understood the night not as something to fear or conquer, but as a natural companion, a rhythm of life as vital as the turning of the seasons. In the flicker of firelight and the soft pulse of candle flame, they found beauty and stillness. They slept in two gentle halves, waking to think, to pray, to whisper, or to dream again. Their beds were shared with family, animals, and the warmth of community. Their sleep carried the scent of smoke and herbs, the hush of wind against wood, the murmur of distant bells. Every night was alive, not with screens and electric hums, but with the small, living sounds of the world itself. Today, our nights are bright and restless. We've banished the dark with lamps and devices, stretching the day until the hours blur together. Sleep has become something we struggle for, something measured and scheduled, rather than something that flows naturally with the rise and fall of light. The old rhythm of rest, the pause between first and second sleep, the sacred quiet of midnight reflection, has been lost beneath the weight of constant motion. In trading the mystery of the medieval night for convenience, we gained control but lost connection. Our ancestors knew the dark as a teacher. It reminded them of their place in the universe, small, vulnerable, yet protected by faith and community. The night made them humble. It gave them space to dream without distraction, to think without interruption, and to share warmth not from a screen, but from one another. The medieval world was imperfect, often harsh, but its nights offered something we rarely touch anymore: true quiet. Not silence, exactly, but a kind of living calm, the sound of the world breathing. The slow crackle of a hearth, the creak of timbers, the sigh of sleep beside another person. These were not mere noises. They were reminders that one was never truly alone. If there is a lesson in the strange and beautiful sleep of the Middle Ages, it is that rest is more than the absence of waking. It is a return to balance. Sleep was not separate from the sacred or the social. It was woven into both. To sleep well was to live well, to trust in the safety of home and the turning of the world. The people of that time may not have had soft mattresses or quiet rooms, but they had rhythm, connection, and meaning. As you listen now, perhaps ready to drift off yourself, imagine for a moment that older world. The fire has burned low, and shadows dance along the wall. Outside, the wind hums softly through the trees, and in the distance, a bell tolls the midnight hour. You rise briefly, stretch, and whisper a small prayer before lying back down, the straw crackling gently beneath you. Around you, the night is vast, but not empty. It holds you, as it held countless others before. Thank you for spending this journey through time with us. If you've enjoyed this story, and it has helped you find a little peace before sleep, please take a moment to subscribe to History for Sleep. It helps this community grow and allows us to keep exploring the past in ways that soothe the mind and calm the night. Leave a comment and tell us what you'd like to dream about next. Or when you listen, whether it's as you drift off, in the quiet of midnight, or at the break of dawn. Now, let the echoes of medieval nights fade gently into silence. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let your thoughts settle like embers in the hearth. The world may have changed, but the need for rest-deep, timeless, human rest remains the same. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you somewhere peaceful, somewhere touched by the quiet wisdom of the old world.